France is seeking Western support for a UN Security Council resolution that names Rwanda as being behind the M23 rebel group attack inside the Democratic Republic of Congo, including the surprise weekend seizure of the parts of Goma, the largest city in the eastern DRC. UN officials said as many as 4,000 Rwandan troops were escorting the M23 rebels. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres on Sunday called on the Rwandan Defense Forces to stop supporting the M23 and to withdraw from the territory of the DRC. It was his clearest statement of Rwandan responsibility for much of the violence, but practical steps to isolate the Rwandan president Paul Kagame are not yet being openly canvassed. Similar sanctions in the past, notably in 2012, forced Rwanda to pull back when aid was slashed. The UN statement drawn up at the end of an emergency Security Council meeting on Sunday called for the withdrawal of external forces without explicitly naming Rwanda. However, it did reference a report by UN expert that highlighted the systematic presence of Rwandan forces in the DRC. The French ambassador at the UN, Nicolas de Ribéry, also urged the UN Security Council to say Rwanda's action were a grave threat to regional peace and security. He said it was time to call a cat, a reference the way in which the international community for different reasons had skirted out the issue of Rwanda's role in arming the M23. Britain and the US in their interventions at the UN on Sunday also named Rwanda and urged Kagame to pull back. Britain, France, and the US have all been reluctant to impose sanctions on Kagame. The US, because of also being dependent on the Rwandan goods, will also be signed an agreement for Rwanda to accept asylum seekers, but the scheme collapsed in the face of legal and political objections. France has been grateful to Rwanda for policing the Central African Republic and Mali, both former French colonies. The EU in 2023 signed a mineral pact with Rwanda. The US has rarely seen Africa as a diplomatic priority, and one of the first steps of its new president Donald Trump was to freeze all aid of the continent. Yet Rwanda would be vulnerable to a coordinated aid withdrawal since a third of Rwanda's budget is dependent on overseas aid. William Ruto, the president of Kenya, is also seeking to fill the diplomatic vacuum by calling an extraordinary summit of the East African Community, which he chairs within the 48 hours on one day. He insisted that the DRC President Felix and Kagame would attend, but there has been no confirmation of this. Some nations, notably Russia and China, as well as the African nations holding rotating seats on the Security Council, are content to issue generalized calls for restraint. Also, Russia says the dispute is rooted in colonialism, a comprehensive critique it provides to analyze most Western actions in Africa. In speaking to the Security Council, the DRC Foreign Minister Wagner rejected any history lessons, insisted favoring the UN imposing sweeping economic and political sanctions on Kagame, including all Rwandan labeled minerals. She accused Rwanda of a declaration of war and no longer hiding behind diplomatic maneuver, adding that it was clear that these crises is directly linked to the economic plunder of the country by